Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to welcome you to this online event. I'm Ruth Hannon. I'm the Joint Lead for the People and Places programme at the RSA. So get comfy whilst I introduce our fabulous panel, a group who bring together thinking on wellbeing in cities, participation and how this affects our lives. I'd like to introduce Layla McCay, who is Director of Policy at the NHS Confederation and founder of the Centre for Urban Design and Mental Health. She comes with experience of the World Health Organization and the World Bank from a background in medicine, international public health and health systems policy. Layla will be telling us about her brilliant new book, Restorative Cities, Urban Design for Mental Health and Wellbeing. Our second speaker is Samantha Tamini Muller, who I have the honour of working with as a researcher at the RSA. She's recently been leading on our work looking at the impact of resident participation on people's wellbeing in Birmingham. Samantha's background is designing and conducting research on complex social issues, and her background includes working on people's experience of migration and youth engagement in politics. And finally, Hamza Tulzal, who is a Labour councillor for the Queen's Park ward and a shadow cabinet member at Westminster Council. Hamza was elected in 2018, becoming the youngest ever councillor at 18. Previously, Hamza was a member of the Youth Parliament and works to represent young people and engage them in making changes to their neighbourhoods to design happy, healthy places for people to live. So let's get going. Please join in the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag RSA Cities or in our YouTube chat. So Layla, Hamza, Samantha, thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to kick off first of all, sort of the reason we've come together for this event, to ask Layla to tell us a little bit about the ideas that are in your book, Layla. So if I could hand over to you, that would be wonderful.
Brilliant, thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so essentially, I wrote this book with my co-author, Jenny Rowe, because essentially there was a big need for it. I've been running the Centre for Urban Design and Mental Health for 5 or 6 years now, and almost every week somebody emails and says, gosh, you know, urban design, mental health, we like the concept, but where's the evidence? Can somebody bring together the evidence and turn it into really practical explanations of what can we actually do that will have an impact on people's mental health and well-being? Not just, you know, you might have a hunch that it might be helpful, but actually, where's the proof? Where are we going to get the value? And that, for me, was the inspiration behind creating this book. So here it is, Restorative Cities. And the way that we have set it up is that, first of all, we've defined the concept of restorative cities, and then we talk about the various components of that. So if you think about the definition, it's pretty simple. We think of restorative cities as a concept that puts mental health, wellness, and quality of life at the forefront of city design. And the research that we've done, which has come from health, it's also come from environmental psychology, from neuroscience, from engineering, from geography, from architecture, town planning, all sorts of different specialties have come together to figure out how can certain settings foster recovery from mental fatigue, reduce the risk of developing or recovering or improving the opportunity to recover from depression, stress, anxiety, all the way through to things like how does it impact on ADHD or dementia. And essentially the question is, how can planners and designers use that knowledge to design cities that better support mental health and well-being? So
that's great.
Do you want me to tell you about the 7 components?
Yeah, that would be really good, kind of, because I know in the book you break it down into sort of 7 pillars that underpin this. So yeah, if you could tell us about that, that'd be wonderful.
Absolutely. So the first one is the green city. That's probably the component that has the most historical evidence behind it. How do you bring nature into the city, and how can that have an impact on mental health? Well, the research tells us it can reduce depression and stress. It can improve brain function. It can reduce the severity of symptoms of all sorts of things, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, ADHD, dementia, and it also has benefits. So, for example, reducing heat stress in cities that are affected by that, improving sleep quality. And the impact of the green space on people's mental health is obviously modified by all sorts of factors that are really important. So the amount, the accessibility, how far it is from your home is really important, for example. Whether it's just that you can see nature, whether it's that you're immersed in nature, the biodiversity is actually quite important. Having just one type of tree, for example, is going to be less beneficial than having that complexity. I think that COVID-19 has very much shed a light on the benefits of nature as well. So that's been really interesting, but it's also shed a light on the disparities in access to nice nature that has those mental health benefits. So that's pillar number one, which is the green city. The blue city, that is about water. Again, there's a huge long history of how water is good for mental health and well-being. All sorts of spas and healing properties of water have been spoken about throughout the years. The science tells us that some of the benefits are because of the increased opportunity for fascination and curiosity and interaction. You can hear it, smell it, see it, touch it, taste it, So yeah, it's essentially an incredibly exciting opportunity to improve mental health in the city by just making the most of those water spaces, and of course also making use of the spaces around them, so walkways and opportunities for cycling and opportunities for socialization, etc. But what is really important, of course, is that the quality of that water and the space around it is really important. Nobody's really benefiting from stagnant, dirty, polluted water, or the places that you might stand near that water. The third one is the sensory city. So science tells us that there are all sorts of ways in which senses can be harnessed to exert positive impact on mental health. But when you think about cities, actually what you mostly hear about is senses in the context of complaints. So, some kind of noise that's causing a nuisance, or some kind of smell that people are unhappy about. But there's this real opportunity to actually focus on what are the senses that can give us a sense of belonging, that can give us a sense of being away and restoration, like, positive soundscapes, bird noises, things like that. And then visual complexity is really interesting. It's one of the things that interests me the most. It might actually hold a bit of a key to reducing depression. So, if you walk past a block that's just one big supermarket or whatever it may be, that has no particular features on the whole wall of the block, that puts you at more risk of having thoughts that are associated with depression. Whereas if you have lots of little smaller shops, they're quite inviting, there's things to look at, they're quite complex, that can be much more beneficial for your mental health. So number 4 is the neighborly city. So that is about how can we use urban design to build stronger social networks, help people develop these strong supportive relationships, and these can be of all sorts. So one opportunity that we often talk about in urban design is bumping places. Places that are good at instigating impromptu encounters with people. So people that you might often see just to nod to at the market or a coffee shop or a dog park, walking along the street. Obviously, as I mentioned before, it is quite beneficial to have these smaller shops that are available. If you're walking between shops or facilities, you're much more likely to see other people in your neighborhood and maybe even nod to them than you are if you're just driving from place to place. But you can also design all sorts of things in the urban environment to improve social interaction, like housing, for example, parks, community gardens, urban farming opportunities, all those sorts of things, obviously catering to the sorts of different public and semi-public spaces that people want to use. 5th one is the active city. As you might not be surprised to know, the active city gets a ton of research, and that's because it's so strongly linked to physical health. So we hear a lot about how you can design cities to improve active transport, so walking, cycling, that sort of thing, improving the infrastructure, improving the facilities that helps people be able to do that. And what's really important to know is it's not just about physical health. active city can also really improve your mental health, all sorts of ways. It can reduce depression and anxiety, it can improve your stress regulation, improve your brain health, your memory functioning. All of those are really important factors in mental health. So yeah, and I guess that's quite linked to another factor we have, which is probably one of the newer factors when you think about urban design, which is the playable city. I think we all know that, you know, play is integral to child well-being, physical, social, cognitive, emotional development. But what's really important here is that actually the concept of playability is important for all ages. And that's not just children. You can design all sorts of opportunities for adolescents, for adults to interact with their environments, whether that's what they call pure play contexts, like a playground, or other playable contexts, like interactive art exhibitions or Parker settings, those sorts of things. The final attribute, number 7, is the inclusive city. So we interpret that as design in the city that makes everyone feel that they belong and that they can use it and that they're welcome. All ages, genders, race, ethnicities, sexual orientations, socioeconomic status, the full diversity of physical, sensory, cognitive needs and abilities. And we know that urban design has in the past and probably to this day contributed to segregation and exclusion and prejudice in cities. And that has a real impact on people's mental health. It can affect their self-esteem, their dignity, their independence, their ability to actually make use of all that the city has to offer. So there's all sorts of ways in which you can design cities to be more inclusive. And it's a real priority because it has this huge impact on mental health. So really, I think that when you think about the restorative city, it's not like you can just work on one of those pillars and it's sorted out. It's more of a network of effort. And I think that when we've looked at the thousands of studies that we have, then there's certain things that have emerged, psychological processes that can be really built into the city. One of them is fascination. So to what extent does the design of your city, you know, spark your interest and your wonder, your curiosity? Another one is compatibility. Cities need to be a good fit with your needs. This concept of being away, so a sense of escape from the everyday, whether that's, you know, looking over views, looking over nature, lifting you out of the everyday. And then linked to that is extent. So being able to not just feel like you're in your little space and you can't see out of it, being able to look up to horizons and out and away. And, you know, people ask us, what are the strategies we can use to make a difference to mental health? So I think that there's lots of things in what I've just told you, but looking at those curiosity and fascination and feelings of being away are a really good place to start. So that's essentially what we cover in the book, with lots of ideas of how people might go about doing some of those things.
Thanks, Layla. It's a really interesting book, especially with the examples you have of cities that have enacted some of these principles. And Hamza, I'm really curious, you know, as somebody who has influence in a city and has worked to enable young people to have that influence as well. I wonder if you could tell us how that's played out for you, kind of bringing young people in, especially thinking about that sort of idea of fascination and curiosity, which sometimes young people really bring to engagement. I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how their experiences and yours have tried to influence the place that you all live.
Yeah, definitely. I think in the communities we live in Westminster anyway, there's a lot of regeneration going on. And I think that's sort of a word that we hear quite often nowadays, sort of a buzzword. It's we're regenerating the area, we're going to be knocking down these blocks and building new one and improving the community. So for me, it's always about how can I engage with young people, because we always talk about young people as if they're unengaged, as if they don't want to take part in local democracy or politics, or is not interested, but deep down they actually are. And in order to find out how they're interested is to show them how local government affects them. So in our case, it's the regeneration that's going on. If we speak, I think one example I always use is I was walking home one day from a meeting, and a young person sort of outside the shop said to me, "Oh, do you know what are those papers about? Do you know what's going on in the area?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Oh, is my auntie's block going to get knocked down? Or is my grandmother's block going to get knocked down? Or what are they going to do to the football pitch in the estate?" And it's sort of, those are the questions that sort of pop up now sort of often. And for me, it's being able to say to them, wait a minute, if you guys really want to find out, then pop along to the meeting, come along, make sure that your voice is heard, make sure that you're not sort of being neglected or ignored as a young person. Because at the end of the day, these regeneration projects take 20, 30 years. So they're the ones who actually ultimately are going to be living in a world that's sort of created for them. So yeah, for me, it's just about, so what we do locally is in Queen's Park, the ward I represent, is we actually have a community council as well. So community council in Queen's Park, we have the only parish council in London. So what that means is that the area is split up into even smaller wards. So in Westminster, we've got 20 wards, whereas in Queen's Park, they've got several other wards which are sort of smaller and sort of done on a sort of street by street basis. And they've got their own sort of elected community councillors. And what that means is that the area has a larger influence and larger say in terms of what happens in their area. So if a block is going to get knocked down or a sports centre is going to be changed or repurposed, it's not going to happen just because the Westminster Council wants it. It happens because the Queen's Park Community Council wants it to happen as well. So it's all that sort of integrated working and making sure that different groups in different areas are all being consulted, all being made aware of what's going on, but actually heard. My biggest annoyance with local government sometimes is we like to talk to people and tick boxes and say we've spoken to young people, we've spoken to this group of people, this group, etc., and then not listen to them, because then in 10 years time, when those blocks are built and those changes are made in the community, those same people turn around and say, wait a minute, we didn't ask for that. And by that time it's far too late. So it's sort of, what can we do early on to engage, for me anyway, young people, but what can we do to engage local residents? What can we do to ensure that they're passionate about their communities? If that means making, it could be anything. It could be making a street wider. It could be changing the use of a road. It might be putting a flower shop somewhere. It might be putting a football pitch somewhere. It could be absolutely anything. But as long as residents are engaged and are sort of consulted and they have the power to make those changes in their community, then for me, that's a win-win. So it's all about advocacy and sort of ensuring that their voices are properly heard.
Thanks, Hamza. I suppose that brings us nicely to thinking about the work that Samantha has been doing, which, thinking about Layla's ideas from the book, Samantha, and sort of Hamza's kind of, getting residents really involved and engaged in sort of decisions about their area. I wonder if you could tell us a little about the work that you've done in Nechells in Birmingham.
Of course, thank you. The community councils sound wicked, and I'd love to know more about them. I'll start with a little bit of context. We've been working with a small, diverse group of residents in a neighbourhood in Birmingham called Nechells. The neighbourhood is really close to the city centre. It's pretty small. So as a ward, it's got about 13,000 people. It's got a really diverse population, and it's really close by to a lot of changes that are happening in Birmingham. So, for example, HS2 coming on, the Commonwealth Games happening next year. But for some reason, and these are the words of the residents themselves, Nechells has been kind of left behind a little bit, forgotten a little bit. For some reason, it just doesn't have the kind of investment and attention from political figures, from key decision makers, that might really help it to kind of thrive as a neighbourhood and as a community. And that's partly to do with redrawing of wards that happened in 2019. That means that the councillor doesn't really physically sit in Nechells anymore. It doesn't really, it's not really about. So when we started this piece of work with them, one of the things that people really spoke about was wanting to find kind of an alternative means for community voice, for a way to bring different residents together, to have a bit more of a say on the different things that are happening in the place that they live. And so we used something called a citizens assembly model, but we scaled it down to the neighbourhood level, which introduced a couple of changes, but meant there were some really interesting both individual and community level outcomes from it. So Layla, thinking about kind of the key principles that you've kind of pulled out in your book and your thinking, the recommendations that they themselves came up with after about 8 weeks of working together, really trying with all the principles that you mentioned, really centering around community, around connection between kind of residents, but also other people that play a role in the neighborhood. So it might be local organizations, politicians, local businesses, whatever. Also creating better spaces for people to use them as individuals and as a community together as well. And so there's a lot of alignment there. But then in terms of the outcomes, what was really interesting was there was a real sense of building community power through this process, which is not necessarily something that comes out of your typical citizens' assembly piece of work or model or approach. But they built this real sense of community power. And what was even more amazing was kind of following the formal close of what we were calling the community assembly. They've gone on to really kind of catalyze around that sense of community power. They're meeting as a group on their own now. They're trying to follow up with some recommendations, reaching out to all the different stakeholders that we engaged with through the community assembly. So really trying to make some of those recommendations happen themselves, but also connecting the dots between all the different people who play a role in the neighborhoods to kind of help it be what they want it to be in the near future and beyond.
Thanks, Samantha. Yeah, I mean, it feels like I think that was one of the things that really struck me about Layla's book was how much those principles really aligned with what those residents said that they wanted from their local community and how they wanted it to be for them. Layla, you've got some good examples in the book of places that are sort of doing some of this, and thinking about Hamza's experience with residents in his ward and the community assembly. What do you think are the things that catalyze those places to suddenly really to sort of embed that idea of well-being into their design of place?
There's a lot about what the people who live and work in those communities actually want and how to empower them to have that voice, to be able to say, hey, this is what we want, this is what we need. And there's a lot in the book, and there's a lot in all the discussions that I have with architects, with designers, with planners, saying, great, we've got these ideas, how do we get them into practice? I think that a key challenge is making sure that you get the demand right. And that's the demand from all sorts of levels. So first of all, of course, there needs to be the demand from the people who are commissioning and paying for whatever this new developments might be. Quite often, people will not necessarily put mental health and well-being at the top of their list of things that they want to invest in. They might do, but around the world, over and over again, I hear that that's not the case. Quite often, the priorities might be how much money will we make from this, for example. And if you're going to go into health, then potentially, is there some kind of physical health benefit? Or is there at least not going to be a physical health problem? I mean, before you even get to whether it might benefit health. So then by the time you get to mental health, some people might not have that as a priority, is what we often hear. So I think that there's a bit here about making sure that the people who are commissioning and who are involved in making these new developments, whatever they may be, happen, actually do recognize the priority and the benefit of mental health investment in terms of productivity, in terms of a prospering, thriving community. I think then that there needs to be really good engagement with the people, as I said, who are using these places to make sure that we get it right. And in the book, I talk about lots of different ways of people doing that. You can do a survey. A survey only does so much. The deeper you go into engaging with these people, not only will you get a better product because it's more suited to the people who are going to use it, but actually the processes of being able to empower people to have a say and see that their say is actually making a difference to the overall decisions is really important in itself for people's mental health. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities there, but if I'm going to sum it up in one word, I think that word would be demand.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's, and I'm thinking about Hamza, the work you're doing in your ward, and that sense there that people have a say. I'm wondering, sort of in light of COP26 and the impact the pandemic has had, it feels like that sort of sense of urgency of how our neighbourhoods and communities are kind of shaped and set up feels even more pressing. And I'm just wondering how that has played out in your local area, and what people have felt. That sort of demand, like Layla says, is that become more prevalent, really?
Yeah, I think as things start to become topical in the news, and as sort of different subjects start to become more relevant, residents are sort of more engaged, or not. It's like a different level of engagement, because it might be, like I said earlier, it might be sort of little questions that they ask. So in Queen's Park, for example, it might be, I don't know, can we get more cycle hangers for the bikes, or can we get, I don't know, is there more green space for a lot of people? Surprisingly, have sort of dogs and cats in the wall, a huge amount. So a lot of them would say to me, "Oh, can we have more green space, or can this section of the park be used for dogs, for example?" Which it is. But residents have an interesting way of, how I've sort of learned anyway, of wanting to be engaged. It's not you have to sort of engage with them in a way that isn't demeaning or sort of patronizing or looking down. It has to be in a way which they feel empowered to make a change. They have to feel as if they're able to speak up. So if we have a public meeting about maybe a huge change that's going on in the area, we can't just expect residents to roll through and start asking us all the questions. A lot of the time they'll come and maybe be a bit quiet, not really want to engage. So it's sort of a little back and forth to get them up to where they want to be. And what I've experienced in Queen's Park anyway is just, I don't know, I don't know, maybe I'm being a bit biased towards my area, but Queen's Park has a really nice sense of community. It's one of those areas where you can walk on any street, and obviously every little bit has its problem, but everyone knows everyone, everyone's happy to get along. If I don't know, if a bin isn't taken away properly, then you've got residents on the whole street calling me up and saying to me that bin hasn't been collected on this number, blah blah blah. So it's just, yeah, I just think in terms of after COP and what's going on at the moment, I think it hasn't necessarily increased it, but it's kept it there. It's kept the interest there, especially on green stuff. Green stuff now is really topical. People say to me, "We're going to have more charging points, for example, or about electric cars, etc." And the only thing I can wish is that they were more affordable. I wish that electric cars were more affordable so that residents could access them a lot easier, or electric bikes, for example. We've had a whole sort of shenanigans with the electric scooters recently as well, and that's sort of up in the air at the moment as well. Residents, or young people especially, I'm not sure. Are they allowed to use them? Are they not? Should they be using them? Is it better than getting in the car and driving? So these are sort of little community questions that hopefully we can get the answers to. But yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Hamza. And Samantha, I was thinking about that kind of, the demand idea and sort of giving people permission. And that feels quite resonant for what happened with the community assembly. And just thinking about that idea of the sort of urgency of what residents want, and I suppose it feels slightly different from Hamza's, because obviously he's a really active local politician, but that was very different for Nechells, and I'm just wondering if that shift in their voice being heard, what that might mean for them.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, if anyone wants to get in touch with them, highly recommend. They're a very ready to go group of residents. How the different ways that people engage and accommodating that is really important. Like when we started working them with not so much of an idea of what will come out of it, but just an idea that, let's take up this opportunity with a really engaged group of residents who do want to make a positive change. And the outcomes that came out of it were not necessarily the outcomes we thought it would, but that didn't matter. And we really had to flex around that. That was kind of our role, to facilitate, to help hold that space, but to really let them kind of lead on how they wanted to engage with that space and how they wanted to put that out into the wider neighborhood and work with other residents. And I think it's just about finding all those different ways that people can participate, that people can have their voice heard, and understanding that it won't be the same, and that it's a lot of work for it to work in general, with a whole, there are so many different people that live in one single neighborhood. You're never going to achieve participation unless you have lots of different options and make them as flexible as possible. And in terms of where next with the process, which, like I said, the community assembly formally came to an end, but the process definitely hasn't like ended. It's very much the start of the process. You know, they're doing all sorts of things. They're reaching out to their local council. They're reaching out to people in HS2. They're trying to constitute as a group. Some of them have become RSA fellows, so they can access our Catalyst Fund to start kind of their own social change projects in the local area. So I think it's really just a starting point, and it was really, a lot of them said it was an opportunity for a group of people who wouldn't have necessarily come together around a shared purpose, around a shared kind of investment in making positive change, and that space was really all they needed to get going. And like you mentioned, it wasn't a space that couldn't in the context be facilitated by maybe kind of the council meetings that you hold, Hamza, council-led consultations, things like that. So it was just an alternative, and people clearly wanted that space. They jumped on it, and they're doing amazing things.
That's great. Thanks, Samantha. I'm just wondering, Layla, in the examples that you cite in the book, I suppose it really feels like there's lots of kind of cogs in the machine to get this sort of different way of a city being designed and planned. And I'm just wondering how that has played out for sort of, you know, the residents in those cities, the councils. When those changes happened, did people start to see, oh, actually, you can design well-being and mental health into how our places are?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of complexity to that implementation of mentally healthy design. So, for example, if you think about pedestrianisation of shopping streets, so the research tells us that doing that will very often increase footfall and business to the local shops, but very, very often when that sort of a change is proposed, then there will be a bit of an outcry from shop owners who are concerned that the opposite might happen. So another example is the challenge of creating walkability in most places where cars are king, and there's a bit of a battle for every inch of tarmac that might be used for a non-car purpose. Very often those battles can rage on for years. But what I think, for example, COVID has given us, which has been really interesting, is the opportunity to make some pop-up changes to cities. So, for example, where I live, there has been widening of paths, for example, more temporary bike lanes, the sorts of things that facilitate active use of the city. And I think that having been able to implement these on a temporary basis is showing people that actually it hasn't ruined whatever they were worried it was going to ruin, and in fact it has potentially made the place a better place to live and work for its residents. So I think that there's a bit of evidencing that is really helpful where it can be done, and of course learning from where it's happened successfully in other places. I think we always need to be very careful not to make an assumption that because something worked well in a particular location, it's going to work in your location. Every community is different and has different needs. But I think that combining the evidence of what's worked in other places with what your community is telling you that it needs, and of course, you know, following up on that to make sure that it is working is a really good way of going forward. But there are so many people who have to approve any change. I mean, you have to approve it, you have to design it, you have to fund it. It's a huge process, as we all know. So really, I think that the more evidence that you have, whether that's evidence from the science, whether that's evidence from your neighbours, whether that's evidence from the community, the more evidence that it is needed, wanted, and is going to deliver the desired effect is important. But I think that question of the desired effect is important as well, isn't it? Because it's a question of what do you want to achieve from this? And I think that can help you go in the right direction. And putting what do you want to achieve, actually, community mental health and well-being is a pretty good priority to want to add to the mix.
That's great. Thanks, Layla. Samantha, Hamza, just thinking about that, that Layla said, any thoughts for you, having had that real engagement with people, that sort of any things that you've noticed that have come about because of some changes that have happened as a result of a global pandemic that, you know, we wouldn't have thought would have had a positive impact on well-being, but strangely has had in weird ways. And I'm just wondering if there's any examples that you've seen where that's benefited your community.
Go for it.
All right, cool. I think the pandemic, it's been quite interesting. You know, I'm not going to say it was too fun, but for a lot of people, it just provided an opportunity to sort of space out a bit and sort of just settle down and shut off a little bit from what was going on in their lives, especially their working lives, because it just meant, for example, the ability to work from home. It's something that maybe 2 years ago people would have thought, oh, how dare you work from home? It's not something you should be doing. You should be in the office all the time, blah, blah, blah. But now it's sort of, most organizations, most charities, even the council, they have that sort of ability where you can maybe do a sort of 60-40 split, so maybe a couple of days in, a couple of days out. And that's become completely normal now. And that's sort of, with or without COVID, that's something that's going to last. That's something that's going to, even today, for example, we're doing this on Zoom. It's something that we have the ability to do, and it's accepted because of what's gone on, sort of thing. And it makes life a lot easier for a lot of different people. Locally in Queen's Park, we've seen that people have treasured their community a bit more. They're a bit more wary of what's going on. So we've got so for example, on the trees, around each trees, people go and sort of plant little flowers now, and there's sort of community little pots everywhere, and this makes the area look a bit nicer. They might put, I don't know, decorations every now and again in different places. And last week we had a brilliant fireworks display that was sort of carried out by the community council. And it's just made people feel a bit more together. It's made them appreciate where they live and actually pause and look up for once and sort of recognize, wait a minute, this is the community I live, this is the community I've grown up in, or this is where I've been for God knows how many years. And it's just, I don't know, it just feels a bit more, we're able to appreciate what we didn't realize we had before, which is quite nice.
Great, thanks, Hamza. Samantha.
Yeah, I think trying to bring it back to the community assembly, I think one of the things that people really appreciated was very split opinions on this, right? But that being able to function online and the different benefits that have brought. And a lot of people did, you know, really highlighted that they wouldn't have been able to engage like this if we hadn't been online, and they wouldn't have been able to meet their neighbors in this way if we hadn't been doing it online. So I think just creating different ways to connect, encouraging us to think about how we connect to people we want to connect with as well, you know, picking up the phone to people more often, spending more time with them outside, exploring the little, you know, someone said to me that they never really, in neutrals, there's like a canal that flows through it, and that they'd never really walked along that canal until the pandemic hit. And then one of the recommendations or kind of asks from the community assembly was having kind of just nicer spaces, better maintained spaces. And I saw on the Facebook group that they started that someone had gone to a local organisation, asked for some equipment to go and clean up some of the rubbish along the canal, which they'd never really thought of doing. And I think blue spaces is quite interesting as well in the context of cities. Like I think more and more as the pandemic happened, we really understood kind of our ownership of or our right to access green spaces, but I don't know if that's kind of happened around blue spaces as well. Reflecting on my own personal experience, I've just moved from East London to West London. East London, the canals are, you know, are crazy, like chaotic, so much like different activity going on around them. And I've moved to West London and we have exactly the same type of kind of canal setup, infrastructure, and people use it, but it's got a completely different purpose. It's nowhere near as busy, you know, they don't have the houseboats and the barges with bars on them and stuff. And interestingly, I think the one thing that didn't come out in the recommendations from the community assembly were recommendations around blue spaces, even if they did, you know, go and work with local organizations to start picking up rubbish along the canal. So I think different ways to connect, different spaces that we can use and make the most of are two really like positive things that have come out of the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. I'm conscious that we are running out of time, but this has been really interesting. And just, I think for me, just that connection between sort of the theory behind your book, Layla, and the practice examples that you have in your book, but then also sort of really getting down to those local levels, like Hamza's ward and the community in Birmingham, how people are sort of doing some of those things themselves and identifying them. So that kind of real micro influencing and design, it's really interesting how it, that multi-layered way of improving our cities can happen. I'm sad that we have to draw it to a close there, but I'd like to say a huge thank you to our wonderful panel, Hamza, Layla and Samantha, for their insights. And I've discovered another small community that I now need to visit. So I'm going to go and visit Hamza's ward in London, just like I want to visit Nechel's in Birmingham. And because I just think they sound really wonderful places. And thank you so much, Layla, for telling us about your book. To those watching, I would really recommend getting Layla's book to read, Restorative Cities, and we'll drop the details in the chat. Look at that beautiful cover, and you can find it on our RSA events page as well. Samantha's report about the project in Nechel's will be coming out soon. And if you love a little bit of community action, go find those guys on Facebook as well. They are quite an inspiring bunch. We've got lots of other wonderful events coming up soon. So please do look at our events page, follow our social media channels to see those, and look back at the back catalogue. There's a wealth of wonderful events in there, which are really interesting and stimulating. So I'd like to thank all of our wonderful panel and all of our wonderful guests who I'm hoping will have been commenting and tweeting about our discussion today. So I'm going to let you all go and hope you all have a wonderful day and enjoy your local spaces and improve your well-being. Thank you.